This is the first webinar in our 2006 winter webinar series on special topics. So tonight's topic is toxic plants. The presenter is Jeff Semler. Jeff is a county extension agent here in Washington County, Maryland. We are in Western Maryland. Washington County is the same county in which my research station is located. Jeff and I work a lot on small ruminant programs. Like a lot of extension agents, Jeff has a lot of knowledge in a lot of different topics. But if I had to pick the one topic that is probably his favorite, it's pastures and forages. So when I asked him what talk he'd like to give, he suggested toxic plants. So I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic and turn the program over to Jeff Semler.
Alrighty. I will be watching the chat box only to make sure that you can't hear me, or that you can hear me. As Susan said, I'm located in Washington County, Maryland. We're about 90 minutes west of the craziness that's known as the nation's capital. And I've been a county agent here in Washington County since 1996, and I work with all facets of livestock, but certainly forage is a favorite of mine, as is dairy and sheep and beef. So we'll go on from there. So I don't know what your thoughts were when you signed in for this, but we're going to talk about toxic plants, and just because a plant's toxic doesn't mean that anything's going to die from it. But it's more of an awareness. As Susan said, there are different plants that are different across the country. For instance, I know in the West, milkweed is poisonous, but eastern milkweed is not. And we'll talk a little bit about that. If you were hoping for an exhaustive list of poisonous plants, you're going to be sorely disappointed this evening. Because I know that we have people here from, I saw British Columbia to South Carolina to Maine to the great state of West Virginia and everywhere in between. And so I want to make sure that you don't go away thinking you're going to know everything there is to know about toxic plants. But toxic plants are in both the pasture and the landscape. And I'm going to talk about landscape plants first, because in Maryland anyway, we farm in what's called the urban-rural interface. And a lot of times people will help us out, and they will feed our livestock something that they've cut from their landscape. For instance, the plant you see in front of you, Japanese yew. And that is extremely deadly. And I don't use that word lightly. We had a dairyman here who lost 20 heifers thanks to his neighbor helping him out and feeding the nice heifers. So we're going to go through that. We'll talk about pasture plants. We'll talk about weeds. And at some points, even our forages can be toxic. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Vegetable gardens contain plants that are toxic. The Irish potato is in the nightshade family, as is the tomato and many other plants. So we want to be careful, even when we're working in our gardens, that we're not just willy-nilly throwing some of our plant material over into our pasture fields. I like to think just close the loop. Keep your plant material from your garden, put it in your compost pile, return that compost to your garden, and you're just making everything work pretty well. But again, there are some things. Growing up as a youngster, we used to feed pea vines all the time to our cattle. No problem there. But again, there are some other things we would want to stay away from. Landscape plants, just a few that I listed, but there's lots of other plants that again can be toxic. And some, we'll look at the ornamental cherry there for a second. As I already told you, the Japanese yew is very toxic. But ornamental cherry, as in all cherries, the toxicity comes from wilted leaves. Your sheep, goats, cows, horses, pigs, neighbor children could walk right up to a ornamental cherry, eat the leaves off of it, and everything would be fine. The lightning storm comes through, breaks a leaf or a branch off your cherry tree, falls in the pasture field. A lamb comes up, eats 2 or 3 leaves, dead. And so that's the kind of thing that can happen with those. Red maple gets on there mainly because some of you may have equine. I don't normally talk about horses. Yeah, Acer rubrum is red. That it only turns red when it's in the fall. It's a green leaf, and I'm sorry I used that red leaf. I apologize for that. I should have used a green leaf because for sure many people see a scarlet maple and think it's a red maple, meaning Acer rubrum, and it's not. But back to the back to the red maple, they do have some effects on equine, and it certainly is one of those things that you want to be careful of, especially those of you that have guard animals. Landscape plants are not feed. As I said already, the best place for them is in the compost pile. So now we'll look at what I call plants commonly found in the pasture, and I grouped them in kind of the way they act on the animal. And again, not all of these plants that we talk about will be poisonous to all species. Some of them, obviously small ruminants are more susceptible than some of the larger ruminants just based on body size. As you well know, some people can eat more than others because of their size, and it's the same with animals. The smaller animal takes less of a to be a lethal dose. So we're going to go into a little bit of, I guess, shall we say, panic control here. Many plants are not always toxic. In other words, like I said, the wild cherry, the black cherry, some of the cherry species are only toxic in the wilted stage. Some are only toxic in the frosted stage, and we'll talk about some of those things. Some plants are mildly or medicinally toxic. Many toxic plants are not palatable. So if you keep the plane of nutrition up on your animals, a lot of times you will not see any problem with these plants. A good example, and unfortunately I didn't put it in here because it's not real, it's just coming into our area, but those of you in the South, Tennessee and that way, probably know a plant called perilla mint, sometimes called Chinese basil. It is a toxic plant. And I went on a farm visit, went into a pasture field. You couldn't see the horse's hooves because the pasture field was just polluted with perilla mint. Not one problem in that place because those horses were fat, happy, and overfed anyway. So there was not an issue, but had those horses been starving or overly hungry, they certainly would have eaten those plants and could have been a very, very bad situation. And then some plants are lethal. So nitrate or oxalate poisoning, these plants, again, lots of plants can be nitrate accumulators, but the ones I'm going to talk about are the ones we typically call weeds. There are Sudan, some of our what I call summer annuals that we will use to, at least in our country here in South, to bridge that gap of the what we call the summer slump. in the sorghum families, they can be nitrate accumulators. But what I'm going to talk about is not so much those forage plants as I'm going to talk about weeds. They can they draw these things up from the soil and they store them in their plant tissue. Toxicity problems can occur in animals which feed on these plants. They also aren't necessarily a problem either. You see in the picture there, that's curly dock. It's actually a liver cleanser and can be medicinal. But again, overconsumption, as you well know, the key to life is moderation. Overconsumption can be, again, if an animal is really hungry and has no other choice, then it can be a problem. Lamb's quarter, here's one. Again, a lot of you have small ruminants that will eat lamb's quarter. And again, it's a nitrate accumulator, but under the right conditions, those plants are very palatable, and they will indeed eat those plants and have no ill effects. But under the right conditions, particularly drought, or if you have had a period of drought, you've had some nitrogen fertilizer out there in the field, you get a flush of wet weather, and when I say a flush, that can just be, depending on your drought situation, and there's a quick uptake of nitrate into the plant, or nitrogen from the fertilizer in the plant, that certainly can be a problem. So that's why we talk about nitrate accumulators in some of these plants are not always a problem, but can be a problem. As I already talked about with dock, again, here's a situation where sheep and horses are more susceptible than cattle when it comes to this particular plant. You can see all my slides will give you some, shall we say, symptoms, if you will. Dangerous levels are rare in this particular case. They can cause hypocalcemia, which would be also always, would be a problem more so in lactating females than in anything else. I will say that I did go through my slides and I didn't upload my PowerPoint presentation for the third time, but typically when I say sheep, I also mean goat. I don't think there's a lot of goat reference in here, but I know we have some folks out there with goats, and goats can indeed be lumped in there. Not always. So our liver disease and our sunlight sensitivity. Sunlight sensitivity is one of those things that you really need to be, I hate to say sensitive to, no pun intended. Your livestock can be foraging or grazing, and because of the compound in the plant, can again basically be more susceptible to sunburn. It's certainly going to be a bigger problem in light-skinned or white-skinned animals than it is going to be in dark-skinned animals, but certainly an issue to be aware of. You can also see there that a secondary symptom is liver disease. Again, that's going to be a time when these plants are consumed at a much greater level than that which causes photosensitivity. The cocklebur plant there in my picture is interesting because not only is it a problem from the perspective it can cause an issue with your livestock, but it also can cause an issue with their hair. If you're a person that's raising goats for mohair, or if you're a person raising sheep for wool, cocklebur can be a problem, more of a problem with debris than with anything else. And there you go. Cocklebur does affect all livestock species, and you can see the sulfated glycoside that's talked about there. Again, seedlings and seeds are very toxic. Typically in most of these plants, the concentrations are going to be higher in seeds and certainly in those young, tender leaves. Seeds are rarely eaten in this particular case, although they're very toxic. And again, as I said, just because things are toxic doesn't mean that you're going to have a problem with them. You can imagine you've all pulled a cockleburr out of your coattail or off the mane of your horse or out of the fur of your dog or whatever. So you know that you're not likely to eat that. And again, so even though it is highly toxic, it's not really a problem. In this case, toxicity does remain in hay and silage. It doesn't always. Some of these plants, by ensiling them or drying them, the toxicity goes down, but in this particular case, it does not. And as I said, the burrs can be an economic damage to wool producers. Read here also mohair, anybody that's producing a fiber off their small ruminants. They're a pain in the rear end if you've got guard dogs, so you can kind of get my drift there. Organ failure is another one of those things, and what does organ failure mean? Because isn't liver damage organ failure? Yeah, this is a little bit more of a broad category. These plants contain alkaloids, and so that's a little bit of a different of a causal agent. Again, kidney damage, heart failure, photosensitivity again. And animals typically will not readily eat plants unless there's no other forage. Again, I can't actually reiterate this enough. A lot of these plants, while toxic, while containing toxic compounds, are not always toxic because, again, they're not always eaten. So this is groundsel. A lot of you have seen it. This is a picture of it right there. Some people mistake it for a thistle because of the leaves shape. And again, it's one of those. It is poisonous. Causes acute liver necrosis, quick death, chronic poisoning. Again, you're eating small amounts over a longer period of time. But not palatable. So again, if you're doing a good job of feeding your livestock, you're not going to have an issue with this. Jimson weed, one of my favorites because typically everybody recognizes it as a poisonous plant, but rarely is it eaten by livestock. It's a bigger problem, and I hope I don't have any young deviants on here, but it's a bigger problem with young people. The seeds are highly has a compound that's hallucinogenic, and so a lot of these folks will use them. I guess use them is not a very good term. Abuse them, I guess would be a better term, and they will definitely cause a problem. Most of you are familiar with Jimson weed. It's that, if you've got a barnyard where manure is accumulated for a period of time, loves the rich soil, it loves that dark, dark soil, nutrient rich, and again, those burrs are a problem. The seed pods are a problem from the perspective of they're not a problem. They're a blessing because, again, they're not very palatable. Cardiovascular health. These are the nightshade folks, and these guys can cause a problem. Horse nettle can be a very big problem in pasture fields. We have had some issue with pasture, with horse nettle in our pastures at our goat test station. We certainly recognize the fact that, again, horse nettle is one of those things that is more of a nuisance than an issue from toxicity because, again, nettle. Anybody out there likes eating nettle? Raise your hand. There's little thorns, they're a pain in the neck when when you just have a little bit of it and you want to pull it out. But again, they are an issue. And these are one of those things that when they get into the forage, it makes the forage unpalatable. I mean, sorry, the hay and silage and so on. It makes the hay unpalatable because, again, who wants to eat a nettle? This is just one of the many nightshades. There's lots of nightshades out there. Black nightshade, again, I've already talked about tomatoes and potatoes in your garden. But again, they can actually, nightshade is in a lot of places. And again, the other thing with nightshade, the bright berries can be a problem for children. And I realize that this is a webinar about livestock, but most of us have children or grandchildren. Some of us, that's how we got into the small ruminant deal. You know, it was a 4-H project going wrong. I speak from experience there. I had my first sheep because of my oldest daughter. And so we want to remember that these things can also be a nuisance when it comes around to things other than our livestock. Irritation. Again, this isn't really toxic. But some of these plants, when eaten, can cause problems in the mouth, sores on the tongue, and so on. So we like to talk about those as well. Sometimes it's a compound. Sometimes it's a part of the plant. Buttercup is one of those. There is can cause excessive salivation. Another one is alsike clover that can cause slobbering. Again, we're talking about small ruminants. I'm not talking about slobbers in horses. Here, that's different. The toxin is lost in the buttercup in dry forage or dried forage. But again, the plant is not highly palatable. And so when you see buttercup in your field, you're probably seeing the animals eating around it. Cyanide poisoning, again, this is one that I think is a really needs to be talked about because, again, this can happen quickly, and it can happen when nobody's looking, if you will. You have a thunderstorm, you've got cherry trees out in your pasture field, wind gets up, breaks some limbs, leaves or branches fall down, and that's when a problem can be. I will tell you this, there is folks that think, should I get rid of all my cherry trees? Well, if that makes you sleep better at night, then I say absolutely, get rid of all your cherry trees. If you're a person that doesn't mind going out and walking the pasture, don't worry about your cherry trees. Just make sure that you, after a storm, you're able to walk out and certainly walk your pastures. And the other thing is, if you know a big storm is coming, bring your stock in out of the field where the cherry trees are, and then that'll give you a little bit of peace as well. And again, this is black cherry. This is what we up here call wild cherry. There are, if you happen to have an orchard, you may be growing cherries. I saw some Michiganders on here, and I know that Michigan grows a lot of cherries. I don't know if you guys have your sheep running on your cherry trees or not, but it is domestic as well as and ornamental as well as the what I call wild cherries. It's also interesting, and I don't have a lot of the research on it, but there was some indications a few years ago that there was tent caterpillars eastern tent caterpillars love cherry trees, and there was an incident of some poisoning that was secondary poisoning from the frass of the tent caterpillars, and it was actually an equine in Kentucky. But again, I wouldn't be overly concerned about that, but I did want to make that, or just wanted to mention that as well. Prussic acid poisoning is something that is more of a potential problem, mainly because these are forages that we plant and we intend for animals to eat. Everything else that I talked about before, we are not necessarily thinking, aha, let's plant some curly dock out in the field, and so we can graze our sheep on them. These are, again, typically in the sorghum family, Sudan grasses, sorghum, Sudan crosses. If you want to think about it from the again domesticated side, sorghums are the most toxic, Sudan grasses are the least toxic, and everything else falls in between. However, when I say less toxic, that doesn't mean safe. Under certain environmental conditions, livestock can get prussic acid poisoning. Typically, what we run into more up here in this country is from frosted. So you want to be careful if you're pasturing. You want to be careful when you turn the animals out in the fall, especially if you've had a hard frost. You want to make sure you don't do that. You want to keep them off those plants until you're absolutely positively sure they're dead. Again, we want them to be brown. Read here, brown. The other thing you want to make sure is do not harvest them because the poison stays in the feed. While it's mitigated a little bit, it is still a problem in whether it's in solid or whether it is dry hay or whatever. So remember that as well. Here's a wild variety of in that sorghum family. I don't have shattercane picked up here, but shattercane's another one. A lot of people think of Johnson grass as a weed, and certainly as an employee of the University of Maryland, I have to say that because Maryland considers Johnson grass a noxious weed, but it can be a great forage. It is one in the warms. It is a warm season grass. Animals will eat it and love it in proper conditions. The real issue with Johnson grass is keeping it in the sward because they will go to it first. They will eat it down to the dirt, and then it will not persist. But again, we're worried about it from the perspective of it being a contributor to prussic acid poisoning. So even if you don't grow it, even if you're a Marylander and you do your due diligence to keep it out of your pastures and so on, don't forget the fence rows, or back behind the round bales that you have tucked away at the edge of the field. There's places where Johnson grass can kind of hide out, if you will, and we want to be careful during that stress time of frosting that we don't lose animals to Johnson grass and to prussic acid poisoning. We've had several folks in our area, not so much from Johnson grass, but from improperly harvested Sudan grass, or sorghum Sudan grass actually, and we've lost some heifers to it because we basically fed them poison. Drought and severe drought is probably one of the most common causes in the South, and for us in this area, it's the freezing cold weather, or the frosting actually. You can note there that the forage is usually considered safe after 5 to 6 days after a killing frost. So you want to be careful of that, and you want to make sure that you're aware of those particular issues. Physical injury plants was one I misidentified. The irritation is one thing, but physical injury is another thing altogether. These are actually parts of the plant. I don't know how many of you recognize, some people call it cheatgrass, some people call it wheatgrass. There's lots of different things that it's called, but the awns on the seed, and I don't know if you can see my pointer or not as I move it, but I can see it. They can get in, especially young livestock, grazing animals. They can get in their nose, lambs, calves, kids, certainly adults as well. But again, we want to make sure you're careful. Again, one of the bad things about cheat is, as you see, bromus is one of the first word there. It's in the brome grass family, so again, if we're going to kill it, we're going to have to use a grass herbicide, and if we're going to do that, then we're going to know that we're going to have to reseed or at least renovate our pasture if we're trying to get rid of cheat. At least in Maryland, and I won't say this is true for everywhere because I don't live everywhere and don't go everywhere, but it typically likes to grow in areas that are well shaded. In our country anyway, you have a place where the animals will accumulate in the sunshine or in the hot sun under some trees. That's kind of where it likes to grow, at least here in western Maryland. Again, I'm not saying that's the way it grows everywhere in the world. Fescue is another one. And fescue is one of those, I think, what I would call the silent thieves. It doesn't necessarily kill anything. And when I say fescue here, I really read here Kentucky 31 fescue. That is one of those grasses that is predominant. It says eastern United States, but quite frankly, I think the fescue belt runs at least as far west as Missouri and Arkansas. Anybody out there further west, I'm willing to listen to you. But again, we have a lot of K31 fescue in our country here. You can blame it on Dwight David Eisenhower. He's the father of the interstate highway system, and fescue does a great job of holding soil, and so a lot of the interstate highway system, once they've disturbed soil and put roadways in and so on and so forth, they planted K31 because it would hold that soil and do a real good job of it. The problem is that K31 doesn't stay home. It likes to move, and it will move. So the other thing is, most of the time there are some different varieties of fescue that you can tell, but most of the time when you're looking at fescue, fescue looks like fescue looks like fescue. So the only way to really know if it's not K31, well, I shouldn't say the only way. There's two ways. One is, did you plant a novel endophyte or endophyte-free variety? And if you did, then chances are you've got the predominant variety in there will be that. If it volunteered on its own, chances are pretty good that K31 is what you have. The way to really know is send it to Auburn. Auburn has a test. Auburn University has a test, and maybe other universities do too, but I've sent samples to Auburn, and they can test for the alkaloid that we're talking about in that particular species. And you can see the problems there. Rarely, if ever, do I know of people that lose animals. Again, that's in the east. I'm not saying in the west. I've seen pictures of fescue foot. I've seen pictures of sloughed off tails. I've seen a lot of that kind of stuff. But quite truly, there are probably more problems with embryonic death, poor doing, if you will, or poor growth rates than there is any other problem with it. And here's just some potential effects from fescue toxicity. Again, I think you're seeing it's more of a robber than a killer, but certainly something that I think we have to take into consideration. Now, I will say there's, at least in our country here again, fescue is that grass everyone loves to hate, or you love it or hate it. Typically, beef producers love it for stockpiling and feeding after around Thanksgiving and so on. But it is certainly one of those things that in the dead of summer you have to be careful. Again, the good news about fescue, like other plants that are toxic, if you have a pasture and you go out and you see these great big clumps of grass that are kind of tall, and then you see everything else around it eaten down to the dirt. That's because you've probably got some bluegrass or other cool season varieties in there, and they are certainly preferring them. When I say they, I mean the livestock. And they will eat that bluegrass to the dirt, and they will let those big clumps of fescue be. Now I will say, after they're frosted, fescue is a wonderful grass for stockpiling for all species. There's not, again, after a killing frost, animals will go down through the snow to a certain extent, and they will eat that grass, and it is perfectly fine. But again, summertime, my suggestion here in Maryland anyway, raise it early in the spring, get off of it by depending on the time of, or the different years, get off of it when it gets really hot. That may be mid-June, that may be late June, that may be mid-May. It just depends on what it's like here, and then we're going to rotate to our other grasses and get off of that, and then come back to it after a killing frost. So you need to minimize it. Dilution is the solution for pollution, as they say. I like clovers, or you can interseed other grasses. Again, you can plant novel endophytes or endophyte-free. We've had Max Q, which is a proprietary name, by the way, for a novel endophyte, for about almost 20 years now. So we're learning some things about it. Again, the persistence seems to be pretty decent, but I wouldn't say that it's as tough as K31. You should avoid summer grazing, as I said. Watch nitrogen fertilization. It does stockpile well, and again, it can be a great forage at the right time. Breeding, don't breed on infected pastures. Again, as I said, you have the issue with embryonic death because of the raising of the body temperature of the livestock that feed on it. I saw in the chat box, and I know, Susan, I wasn't supposed to be looking in the chat box, but here are some resources for poisonous plants. I kind of distribute them a little bit. I've got Oregon State on there. I've got the middle of America there, Purdue. Two of them that I use a lot are at the top, so that doesn't make them the best. That just makes them in the east. Cornell's site and UPenn's site. Again, you can search by common name. If you know it, you can do some other searches. The very bottom piece there is actually from Purdue, and that's about prussic acid poisoning. I put the URLs in there because I didn't know how it would work. That way you could write them down and put them in your browser, as opposed to if I wrote the name of the publication, it may not translate for you quite as well. But again, those are some of the resources that I use here in Maryland. And again, like I said, if you have a state out there, I'm sure they have a poisonous or at least a resource that you could use. But again, those are the ones that I like the best. And the UPenn site is very nice as far as trying to key it out as well. But I'm sure there's other sites out there that do just as good a job. As I said, in the east, we worry about different plants. If you go to the Oregon State site, you'll notice some plants. I saw some friends out there from Washington State, British Columbia, I think. You're going to have some plants on that Oregon State site that we will look at them and say, what? And again, that's one of those things as well. Well, it's 45. We're in 45 minutes. I kind of glossed over, I know, probably for some of you, the topic, but I certainly would like to take the opportunity to answer any of your questions that you would have. I will give you a little bit of a talk or a description of the picture you're seeing in front of you there. That's our goat test site here in the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. Those goats standing there are in a novel and an endophyte-free pasture, fescue, and clover there. So they are one of those fescues that I talked about. What about Susan? How do you want me to handle this?
I've been jotting down questions because if you look at the chat box, there's been some private discussions going on and some people commenting and trying to answer each other's questions. So I've gone through and come up with some questions, and when we get through them, if there's still some more, I'll encourage you to type them back in the chat box. The first question was really more of an opinion. Someone from West Virginia was asking what your opinion on hemp dogbane is.
Well, I understand it causes, it's the causal plant for werewolves. But no, in all seriousness, dogbane, while it does contain some toxin, it's one of those things about that we talk about not being toxic because they don't eat it. If you remember, I don't know if it's an old wives' tale or maybe it's just an old farmer's tale or somebody real smart tale but white sap typically means poison. And so remember, when you break open milkweed, when you break open dogbane, it has that white sap. But I have not found it to be a problem at all. Now, again, probably because they don't eat enough of it, or if they eat a little bit of it, it doesn't affect them.
Okay, the next question, I actually think you might have answered this, but this was a question from Maine, and that was whether buttercups were toxic.
They do lose some of their toxicity when they're in the hay. So I guess the short answer to that question is not really.
Okay, another question. You provided some websites that are good references for toxic plants. Do you know of any good books or manuals? Specifically for goats.
I do not know anything specifically for goats. There are, again, because of my geography, there's a great book called Weeds of the Northeast. I don't know if there's a Weeds of the Southeast or Midwest or Pacific Northwest but that's a great book. It talks not everything in that book obviously is going to be a toxic plant, but it certainly is. It does talk about the ones that are toxic.
And I think you also pretty much answered this, but I'll let you to hit on it again. If sheep are affected, do we assume...
We always assume that sheep and goats are interchangeable, only because we don't know any better. Typically, again, you want to think about how before we get too excited about poisonous plants, remember that the animal is usually smarter than we are. So I don't get, if they're fed well, I don't get too excited about it. Remember, goats are browsers, so there's going to be some of these plants that are more erect and more apt to be browsed than to be grazed. But typically, again, we do interchangeably use sheep and goats.
Okay, here is another question from West Virginia. Are horse
nettle berries a problem? They are. It's the little tomato, and again, it's one of those things that they're not highly toxic any more than the green peel on you've all heard this. Don't eat the green peel on your potato because that's poisonous. Well, if you sat down and ate, your weight in green potato peels, you'd probably die, and maybe it would be a toxin that killed you. But they're, again, the little berries do contain some toxin, but they're not not something we overly are concerned about.
Okay, what about cherry leaves? Do they cause problems?
If they are brown, no.
Question from me.
If they are wilted, yes.
Another topic that actually generated a lot of interaction in the chat box was about apple and pear leaves.
They are, to my knowledge anyway, we think of them as palm, not stone. Cherry is stone fruit. Pear and apple are palm fruits, which are different. And so, at least to my knowledge, no. And yes to the, is hemlock, I'm sorry, Susan, I'm going off the page here, but I didn't want to miss the hemlock because I did forget hemlock. And we do have hemlock here in Washington County. It is poisonous. Some people call it water hemlock, but there is a hemlock, and not Canadian hemlock, not the tree, but an actual weed. Go ahead, you can ask another question.
Okay, the fescue endophyte, is that found?
That is where the concentration is the greatest, but it is not only found there. So another way to, I guess, mitigate, not eliminate, is to clip your pastures and get seed heads out, or if you're making fescue hay, make sure there's not a lot of seed heads in it. There are some, no, I'm gonna stop there.
What about pigweed? Is it toxic?
Pigweed is a nitrate accumulator. So the short answer to that question is yes. The long answer is they usually don't eat it. But it can be toxic. And there's lots of, pigweed is in the amaranth family, so there's lots of different variants of that. Some of them are more of a problem in a lot of different ways other than being toxic. If you've ever heard of spiny amaranth, if you haven't, grab a hold of it one time. It grabs back. There's a little thorn right under the leaf, or actually not the leaf, where the leaf connects to the stem. Some of you maybe have heard of Palmer amaranth. Palmer amaranth is a problem in the South because it's now become Roundup resistant. But again, not really a problem from the toxic part, other than the fact that it can overwhelm a pasture, especially if it's Palmer amaranth. And again, we're going to be concerned about that not because of the toxicity in and of itself, but the fact that there's nothing else out there to eat and they got to make a steady diet of amaranth. That may certainly be an issue.
Someone asked the question, does clipping your pastures help to control or help to eliminate toxins?
Doesn't help to eliminate them. It may help to control them. Clipping is always one of those things that is a forage management tool and is a weed management tool. The issue will be when you clip, and again, my perspective is always about the good forage, not always about the bad forage. So I'm going to clip pastures for the reason of the good forage. But if I have a pasture where I'm not able to use a herbicide, then I would definitely consider clipping right before, well, no, I shouldn't say that, right after they hit the reproductive stage, but before we get to hard seed. A lot of people want to go out and mow their horse nettle, for instance, in the fall. If you want to spread horse nettle seed all over your pasture in those little yellow tomatoes, and they're not really tomatoes, but they're in the tomato family, the little fruit, then go for it. Go out there and mow your horse nettle, and you will accomplish that. If you are not interested in doing that, then just let the frost take care of it.
Okay, a question from one of my favorite places, Prince Edward Island. Is goldenrod toxic or potentially toxic?
Again, depending on, the short answer is no. And again, almost any of these plants that are asked about, including what we call our chosen forages, can be they can be toxic because some of them can be nitrate accumulators. But on the short answer, again, goldenrod is not typically considered. It's definitely considered a weed, but it's not always considered. It's not considered highly toxic.
Joy from Maine has a pasture full of buttercup and wants to know how to get rid of it.
Well, there's lots of ways to get rid of it, but the question really is, how can, or what do you want to do? When it comes to renovation, you can use a couple different options. Obviously, you can use herbicide. Okay, without herbicide, I got that. So you're gonna have to use tillage, and then you want to put in a very competitive grass. In your neck of the woods in Maine, you want to use something that's going to outcompete any buttercup seeds that you nastily wake up with tillage. So my suggestion would be to probably, again, Maine, here in Maryland, I'm going to tell you to seed in the fall, but maybe the spring is better in Maine because you don't have quite as long of a growing season. So I'm going to suggest that in addition to planting grass, your grass may be orchard grass or one of the endophyte-friendly fescues, or maybe a mix with timothy and a little bit of ryegrass and so on. Also add some oats as a nurse crop. Oats is very nutritious, and oats is also one of those things that can help when it comes to outcompeting some of your weeds. And then if you know you have a problem with buttercup, then avoid overgrazing.
Okay, Joanne from New York had a question. She had a ewe that had a swollen face for about a week. I've had that too. Not me, but one of my sheep. Do you think that could have been a forage?
Oh, it's possible.
Is that possible?
I can't say that I'm going to be able to run right to the toxin that it might have been, but it is possible. It also could be, depending on where the face was swollen, what area, it could have also been one of those injuries, shall we say, maybe in one of the awns from or a thorn or something, but I'm suspecting you a whole head. Okay. Because it was a whole head, similar to a small pumpkin, trusting you didn't carve it as a jack-o'-lantern, it would have probably been a toxin, but I couldn't tell you exactly which one.
There's a question that says, what about rhubarb? I don't know if I've missed that as part of another discussion, but is somebody asking about controlling rhubarb or whether it's toxic?
Well, parts of the rhubarb plant are toxic. But again, I don't know why you would want to feed rhubarb. I'd say if you have rhubarb, make a pie. Usually goes better if you use strawberries as well. But otherwise, I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. But there are some, I think typically, and again, I'm looking at humans as opposed to sheep and goats here. I believe it's the leaves that are more toxic than the stems. But again, if they're not eating it, then it's not a problem.
Here's a good question, maybe a little bit off our topic, but Deb from Virginia is asking about vegetables. It's not that I don't think animals go out and graze vegetable fields, but a lot of people like to give veggies. She names kale, for example, to goats. Anything you want to care to comment on that?
Certain parts of the plant can be, again, I'm not speaking about kale in particular here, but certain parts of vegetable plants can be toxic. For instance, we know, again, I hate to always run back to nightshade, but we know like leaves and stems and so on of potatoes and tomatoes can be toxic where the actual tomato is not. I don't know of any reason why kale in particular would be an issue. Some of the other cucurbits, I'm not sure, would be an issue. Pumpkin, they like pumpkin. Lots of them will get an orange face if you, and this is the fruit, of course, but again, vines. But my suggestion always is, unless you're sure, then I would probably lean on the side of throwing it in the compost pile.
Okay, there was one more question I thought I saw. Trying to think it's right near the end. Oh, milkweed. Bree from Maine has been told that eastern milkweed is poisonous and wanted to know if there was more than one type of milkweed.
Not that I'm aware of. Again, it does get a reputation of being poisonous. I've not experienced, I have had sheep and goats eat milkweed. Again, it does have a white sap, but I've not seen any incidents of it being poisonous. Again, it may be the fact that animals choose not to eat a lot of it, so it may be one of those things that is a little bit toxic, but not necessarily enough of a toxin in it to affect us here in the East. Again, Western milkweed's completely different from the toxicity standpoint, and it can be a pretty bad thing.
We have a question about pine needles. I think that's a really good question because I know every year I'll make a post on my Facebook page about people feeding Christmas trees, particularly to goats, and of course sheep will eat them too. And some people will jump on that post saying, no, you can't feed Christmas trees, you can't feed them to...
No, don't know that they're toxic.
So what about pine needles?
Didn't actually, when I was looking at landscape plants in particular, I didn't see them come up. Again, I have seen, and I can't say that I've actually done the feeding of the Christmas trees, but I can tell you that it's been my experience that they eat it and it does not bother them.
I think some people are concerned about maybe what chemicals may have
been
sprayed on the tree.
That is one of those things that you never know. Typically, again, know this, that all chemicals are regulated by the EPA. You can like them or hate them, and I'm just going to tell you this. And they do an extensive work with the companies proving these herbicides, insecticides, or whatever to be safe. And they're, again, for a pine tree, they're going to look at what is the most susceptible creature that could come in contact with that. The most susceptible creature is your child at Christmas time. And so there are withdrawal times for these products. And again, now that also assumes that everybody does what they're supposed to do, and they read the label and they follow the label, but there shouldn't be a problem.
There's a question, what's the difference
genus and
between
species.
And a yew?
And I hated to sound sarcastic there. Again, pine, longer leaves, and again, depending on the species, because some of your pine trees are single needle, some of them are multiple needle. Typically, a yew is a very short, kind of a waxy cuticle on the leaf, so you can really tell what they look or how different they are.
There's a couple of questions in here about pasture in general, and before I have Jeff address those questions, I'd just like to ask if there are any more questions specific to tonight's topic of toxic plants. And then I'll let him address the pasture questions. Any more questions? Anything specific about Photinia?
Yeah.
I just see that in the chat.
I'm going to put a question mark at the end of that word too.
Because there are a couple of questions in here about renovating pastures and also about resources for pasture renovation. And I know that's a very broad topic, but I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that. I'd have to go back up further to see what the specific questions were. But one was about renovating a dormant pasture, about a recommended pasture mix. One was about just recommendations on renovating pastures, and one was about resources.
Well, as far as pasture renovation goes, my suggestion is, again, based on my experience in Maryland, we like to renovate pastures in the fall. And fall is breed here after August 15th where I am. That may be different where you are. There's a couple ways you can do renovation. You can overgraze, and you can then come in with a pasture mix. And I'd always like pasture mixes. I do not like, Andrew there is giving you a pasture mix for Maine. There are, as I look at that pasture mix, one of the things I wouldn't put in it would be perennial ryegrass because it doesn't persist in our climate. But in New England, certainly in the area of Maine where you get some moisture, I would think perennial ryegrass would probably do fairly well. But here in Maryland, it's not going to do very well. It's going to come up. It's what I call a feel-good grass. Perennial and annual ryegrass, annual's different, but perennial ryegrass comes up in the fall, looks really good, and by the time next July rolls around and it gets hot and dry here in Maryland, it goes away. But back to the renovation question, you can use tillage, you can use overgrazing, you can use herbicide and no-till. You can use a combination of those things. Again, it depends on what you want to use. I can help you with renovation, whether you want to use herbicide or don't want to use herbicide, whether you want to use tillage or not use tillage. There's lots of different options out there. But again, predominantly for us, we're going to use cool season grasses. I do like mixes, and I always like legumes. And again, in Andrew's mix, there's some chicory in there. We actually use chicory here at the research farm. We had a paddock that was, I don't want to say 100% chicory, but it was a high percentage of chicory. When I say high, I mean over 70%. And goats loved it, but we didn't have enough animals to really control it the way we needed to, and it would bolt on us and go reproductive.
Okay, any more questions about poisonous plants? I see there's a question about what to do when a goat ate something that it shouldn't. I'm probably going to say that that's something you need to discuss with your veterinarian or look up in some of those resources. Not really something we can cover here tonight.
That's correct.
Jeff, you agree? Okay, if I missed any questions, or has Jeff missed any questions, are there any additional questions? What about ferns?
Yes, some of the ferns can be, not all ferns, but there are some ferns that can be an issue. And I'm going completely from memory right now and not from a textbook, but I believe fiddlehead ferns are one of them, but I won't swear to that. But there are some ferns that are indeed.
Yes, bracken fern. Tamara makes a comment about getting back to the question about what to do about a goat that eats something it shouldn't. The vets know nothing about goats. Hey, that's a whole nother topic, but I'll tell you what. We have to make sure that we start working with vets, even if we don't want to and if they don't want to work with us. That goat just ate something it shouldn't, take it to the vet office. We've got to get them involved. And they're not going to be able to help us answer these questions unless they start to get experience, and they're not going to get experience unless we start taking our animals to them. So it's something we really have to work on. Again, a topic for another time. And, again, addressing the veterinary situation a little bit, is that sometimes our best hope is with the young ones, the ones that are fairly soon out of vet school and they do want to learn. As far as an emergency, most veterinary hospitals have on-call emergencies, or they have numbers. You know, if your dog is into having an emergency, there's a place to take it. There's a place to take that goat to. Don't tell them it's a goat. Tell them my dog ate a rhododendron. Lacey, you mentioned the activated charcoal. That's a common thing given. Yes.
Going back to the Photinia, I don't find anything. We don't grow it here in Maryland, so I'm sorry about that. But it is not mentioned in the Florida toxic plants, and that was the one that came to the top of the page when I did a quick Google search. I'm not anybody like you, or I'm not any different than you when it comes to that. Cornell, she said it's in the Cornell report, so, you know, I guess the thing to do is, as with anything, is err on the side of caution. But like I said, I don't know much about it. It's typically, as I understand it.
Okay, last call for questions.
And anyway, as I understand it, it's a landscape plant, so I always land on the side that if it's a landscape plant, keep it out of the oh, gotcha.
Lilac.
Don't believe so. Not aware of any problems with lilac. We actually had a goat that ate lilac, so I'm going to go with not a problem.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I couldn't agree with the last comment that's just put up there, all things in moderation. A lot of things can be toxic, and a lot of things they say are toxic aren't if
Right.
they're not consumed in high levels.
I just wanted to do, there was an article some years ago, I believe it was in the Shepherd magazine, and there was a study done in Australia, I think, and they were looking at, and sheep in particular would graze some of these, what we call toxic plants, but they were using them medicinally. They believed that they were eating a little bit of curly dock or a little bit of this or that because they needed a compound. Again, I'm not inside the mind of a sheep, but we also don't give our livestock enough credit sometimes. So, again, everything in moderation. Not just because it is toxic, it's not poisonous, and we're going to leave it at that.
Yeah, they're actually doing some work. I guess it's more behavioral research, but I think it's out in Utah, where they've shown that livestock, I guess particularly they're working with sheep, will choose, plants. They got a bellyache, so they'll choose this plant. They do have some intelligence in grazing like that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work. I think his name is Pretenza. I might not be saying that right. He's a behavioralist at Utah State. He's done a lot of work with not only grazing behavior, but also with training animals to eat things that they may not want to eat.